So in all seriousness, I'm actually very, very excited to be here today. My name is Mahesh Prakriya. I'm here along with Polita Pauls, who's actually a senior STE in ASP.NET, and I'm really proud to be here with her talking about some new controls that we built in ASP.NET that allow you to build database apps easier. I think somebody asked, is this just about grid view? The short answer is no. This is not just about grid view on that. So let's talk a little bit about sort of what are we going to talk about in the next hour. Vast majority of this talk is going to be focused on our dynamic data story. If there's only one thing that you take away, it's the ability to build database apps in a much easier way using the ASP.NET Futures release, and I'll get to that in a minute, compared to what you've done before. I don't know about you, but I built database apps in my life. I used to work at Verizon before I came to Microsoft, and I built some database apps, and it made me scratch my head and go, we shouldn't take this long. It really shouldn't. You shouldn't have to worry about so many levels of detail, so much configuration. Isn't there an easier way to get started? And if you look at the open source world out there, I mean, Rails has shown today that there's some interesting ways to build apps that can get you up and started in a pretty fast and rad way. And the ability to go ahead and build a scaffold and get started is a very powerful paradigm that we have. And in that perspective, we've built a set of controls on top of ASP.NET. This is building all on top of the .NET framework and ASP.NET that allow you to build those database apps in a much easier way. So that's the first key point I want you to take away. Towards the end of the talk, I will talk to you about a second aspect of this, which is really about the ability to use this technology, not just from static languages as you've done in the past, such as C# or VB.NET and ASP.NET, but rather the ability to sort of use this from multitude of languages, multitude of DLR-based languages that we just announced this morning, and including Python and VBX and on and on. So we'll do some of those demos. We'll show you what we have. And I think we'll take questions towards the end, unless there are really short, really quick questions that we should clarify as we go through the presentation. That's primarily it. Seems like, OK, cool. So let's talk about dynamic data controls. What are these things? Well, the entire premise is that you have a database. Almost all of you have pre-existing databases that you're using. Or you really create a quick one for a simple database that you start with. And you really have the schema defined and pretty well defined in a way that you want the UI to be auto-generated. That's the fundamental thing that we have, which is, hey, can I just auto-generate the UI off of the database or some local cache that I have or this view that I've created in the database? That's a common question that I hear from users. And so we provide the ability to do so. And not only that, you generate that scaffold, you shouldn't just be stuck there, because I'm sure none of you really take any more requirements once you deal with the first version of the app, right? No, not at all. So basically, once you start the development, how do you take that app that you build and further customize it, either by writing some code or by using some of the techniques that we have called extender pattern? And that's really, that's pretty powerful there. And the ability to do that in whatever language that you choose is a pretty powerful way to do it. So that's basically what we're going to cover. And with that, actually, by the way, the ASP.NET Futures download is live already. And all the technology, these new controls that we're talking about are part of the Futures release. And you can download that if you so desire from the URL below. Don't do that now. Do that after the talk. So with that, I actually want to hand it off to Polita to start a demo, because really, I mean, what you want to really see is code.
Hi, I'm Polita. I've been working on the ASP.NET team for 5.5 years, and I wrote the grid view and the details view controls and several other ones. And through that experience, we learned a lot about what you guys want to see as far as building database apps. And so the dynamic data controls are our attempt to help you build your database apps faster. And to show off the dynamic data controls, I'm going to build a website today. I'm going to use the dynamic data controls to build a travel journal website for you on stage. So I've started Visual Studio, regular Visual Studio, no tricks, and I'm just going to open a website that I've put together, the travel journal website. And in Solution Explorer, we'll look at what's there. I've got a simple theme, so it looks nice. A couple things in bin that help us actually use our dynamic data controls, some images for my theme, a master page, a web config, and then a movie that we'll look at later. And in my app data directory, I have this travel journal MDF file. This is my database. I've pre-populated it so that we can get working faster. But let's take a look at what's in there. If we look at the tables, I have 4 tables: countries, entries, photos, and videos. The main table is the entries table, and in the entries table, I have all of the entries for my photo journal. Entry ID is an auto-generated int. It's the primary key for my table. Then I have a name and description field, a date, and a country field. And the country field is an integer field, and it points off, it's a foreign key, it points off to the countries table. And within the countries table, you see I have a country ID, which again is an auto-generated integer, and a name field. For now, we'll stick with that. And I'd like to build a page for my entries table. To do so, I'm going to add a new item to my website. I'm going to pick the dynamic data web form. Now, this is a template that you'll get if you download the ASP.NET Futures release. And I'm going to call it entries. Now, this is a special name. It tells the dynamic data controls that I'm going against the entries table. And I'm going to pick IronPython, just for fun. Tell it we have a master page. And I get an empty page. There's this one control, dynamic auto data on my page. We're going to talk about that later, but for now I'm going to get rid of it. And I'm going to drop a different control on the page, a dynamic list. So all we have on the page now is a dynamic list control. And remember, it's called entries after the entries table in our database. Let's run it and see what we get.
You pay attention to the schema because almost all the app is generated off the schema. And note the fact that there's a set of conventions that we're following, such as naming the page same thing as the table name.
So here we have a grid view. Looks like a pretty typical grid view. And it's got our name and description field, date and country. I can sort. I can edit. And I can update with no code. We didn't tell it anything except the name of the table. So that's pretty quick. All I had to do was drop that one control on the page, and all of a sudden I have a grid view that shows all of my data. And it's editable. And if you notice this country field, we talked about that a little bit earlier. That's actually an integer field that's a foreign key field off to the countries table. So what you might expect to see here is an integer. However, an integer isn't usually what you want to see for a foreign key field. What you want to see is something off in that foreign key table that's a little bit more relevant. And so that's what the dynamic data controls have done. They've recognized this relationship, and they've gone off to the countries table, and they've found an applicable string field and used that as the display string for this particular field. You also might have noticed that when I hit edit, we got a drop-down box for the country field. And it has all of the possibilities right there. Just because this is a foreign key field, it's recognized that relationship, and it's given us a UI that makes more sense for this control.
So how many of you have done this in Visual Studio today where you're trying to get the database app up and running with grid view, and how many steps did it take versus what it took now? Okay.
All right. So this is pretty fun, but really when you're building a database app, what you care about are the relationships a lot of times. We care about that country's relationship as a database table, and what we'd really like to be able to do is navigate that relationship. So I'm going to show you how the dynamic data controls help us to navigate that relationship more easily. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a page to my website for that countries table. In just the same way that I added an entries page, I'm going to add the countries page. I'll call it countries. We'll use IronPython and select the master page. And again, we get the dynamic auto data control. I'm going to get rid of it one more time. And instead put a details control on my page. I'm using a details control because when we navigate that relationship, we want to see just one country. So I'll save and reload my page. And now I get a link in my countries field because the dynamic data controls have recognized that relationship and seen also that there is a page to fill that relationship so that we can navigate it. So now when I click US, I get a details view that actually shows the data for that US field. And you'll also see that view entries field. That helps us navigate the relationship backwards. Now, there's nothing in the countries table that says, I'm bound to an entry. But because there is something in the entries table, we can navigate that relationship backwards. And when we click View Entries, we see a filtered view of all the entries that are all for the country US. So this is something that's very common and relatively difficult to do today. But with dynamic data controls, you can do it very easily.
This is a common design pattern, right? You have basically the grid view that's data bound, right? And you didn't have to write any code, automatically get started, and you have details view as well.
So when we looked at this countries field, there wasn't a lot of data in this table. In fact, it looks a little plain. You could almost hardly tell that it's a details view that we're looking at. That's because there's only one field that we really care about. But what if I'm told that I need to change schema? And I need to add another field to this table? That's pretty common. I'm going to go ahead and add a new field to this table. I'm going to close down my web browser. And I use Server Explorer to open the countries table and add a description field. I'll save it and close it. And then I'm going to restart the web server. And that'll clear our schema cache. Now let's restart the website. And now we see that the description field has just shown up. I didn't change anything within my website, but I can automatically pick up that schema change, and now I can edit it and add a description. And automatically, our details control can pick that up and add that data to the database. If you were using ASP.NET today, you would probably need to go in and change your pages so that you add a bound field for the description field, and then you would have to go in and change all of your SQL connection strings or whatever to include that description field to update. With dynamic data controls, just add it to your database, we pick it up, and we can use it automatically. So now I think I'd like to add to my entries page. Let's go back and take a look at it. Some more functionality. We see the list of all the items on my countries page, or my entries page, but I think I'd like to allow some filtering. So I'm going to add a new control to my page to allow my users to filter. And I'd like to let them filter by the country field. So I'm going to add a dynamic filter control. And all I'm going to tell the dynamic filter control is the name of the column I'd like to filter on. In this case, it's countries. Let's take a look at what that did for us. You'll notice we have a drop-down list in the upper left-hand corner now. It says filter by country. By default, we pick all. But we've got all the items in that related table, which is the countries table. And we can filter by any one of those. If you've tried to do this in ASP.NET today, it's certainly possible. But it's a lot of code. And you have to set up another data source to populate this particular data source. And then you set up a relationship with a control parameter. If anybody's ever done that, it's possible, but it's a little bit more difficult. This helps you do it automatically.
I think at this point, I'm jealous of Polito's travels there.
I'd like a few more features, so I'm going to add some more controls to this page. Let's add a break so it looks nice. And I'm going to add a details control like we did in the countries page. And then I'd also like my users to be able to add a new record. So I'm going to add, as you might have guessed, an insert control. I'll save it and reload. And now we can see that what we get down here is the details control. It's got the same fields, and an insert control at the bottom so that you can add new items. Now this details control has noticed that it's on the same page as a list control. And you might have noticed that you now get a select button. This select button helps the interaction between the list control and the details control so that you can select one of these items in the list control, and it automatically shows up as a master details in the details control. We also have implemented click anywhere to select. So instead of selecting the select button, I'll just click somewhere else, and we can see it works. This is a very natural UI for people. And without writing any client script, it just works. So this is great, but you're probably thinking now, this isn't exactly the UI I want. I really like the extensibility and the power and the flexibility that I get with my ASP.NET controls. Well, we don't want to take that away from you. We want to allow you to have all of that flexibility and power that you have today. And we want to give it to you with the convenience of the ASP.NET dynamic data controls. So what we've done is the dynamic data controls follow an extender pattern, which means, for instance, with this dynamic filter control, if I want to replace it with my own drop-down list, I can do that. Let's do that now. I'm going to pick a drop-down list and put it on my page. And now I'm going to tell my dynamic filter control that it's going to be extending the drop-down list that I just put on my page. I do that by giving it a control ID property with the ID of my drop-down list. You'll notice that the control ID property matches the drop-down list property. Now I'd like to set some properties on my drop-down list. I'm going to set the back color to yellow. Just so that we can see that it's working. OK, so now you see that the back color is yellow in my drop-down list. So maybe you don't care about setting your back color to yellow.
As you can tell, Polita's a dev.
But maybe you do care about setting your style properties. Or maybe you care about setting the auto postback property. Or maybe you care about wiring up an event handler and setting some programmatic properties or whatever you're going to do with code. You can still do it on your control because of this extender pattern, which means you have all the power of all the controls that these extend. For instance, this list control extends the grid view so that you can actually put a grid view on your page, point the dynamic list control at the grid view, and set all the properties that you would on the grid view control. As you might guess, the dynamic list control, or the dynamic details control, and the dynamic insert control both extend details view controls, and you can replace them with details view controls on your page. This lets you set all the properties that you normally would, but now you don't have to worry about the data binding, because it just happens for you.
Remember, so far Polita has not written any code yet, and there's a pretty rich app already up and running.
OK, let's write some code. So those are great points of extensibility, but I think I'd like to change the columns that are showing within my grid view. Because I have the same columns in the grid view and the details controls, I don't think I need them both places. So I'm going to tell the grid view how to render itself with fewer columns. Remember, we picked IronPython for this page. So I'm going to add a handler for a new method called getColumns. And if any of you read IronPython, then you'll recognize that this is a method. If you don't, define getColumns means this is the method for getColumns, and we're going to return an array. And within the array, 3 members: name, date, and description. And those fields say, these are the fields I would like you to display within my grid view. And when we refresh the page, you can see that we're now seeing name, date, and description just the way we want. We no longer see the countries field because I didn't include that. But now we can see that they're down at the bottom.
This is just a convention that Polito used with the getColumns method to say, return me a list of the columns, and voila, you got those columns right there.
So now I'd like to show you some of the power of IronPython to make this render something a little more dynamic. I'm going to delete the name and date fields. And instead of the name and date fields, I'm going to drop in a little bit more IronPython. And now what I'm saying is I would like one field. The name of the field is name and date. And now I have this lambda. And in IronPython, a lambda is a dynamic method. So all this is saying is I would like every time that this row renders, this lambda method to be executed. And this is a format string. %s points to the first name, and the second %s points to date. So with this little line of code, when we refresh the page, we can see we now get one column instead. It's called name and date, and it has our name field separated by an on, and then the date field.
So what you have here is a composite column by writing a little bit of code, I have the sort of effectively the data set in the back, and munging the two and saying, I want to display this one column that is a combination of the two.
So we can do this really easily and really powerfully with dynamic languages and with the dynamic data controls. You could do this in ASP.NET before. What you would do is you would write a template field, and then you would give it an eval statement, and then you would put your template field inside of your grid view, and then it would be fine. But that's a lot of code to do. And we think it's a little easier to write this one line of code than to build yourself a template field. OK, now that we've written a bunch of code, and I've gotten my form all laid out the way I want, I'm going to get rid of everything. And I'm going to drop one new control in.
This is the full enchilada.
The dynamic auto data control. Save my page. And notice that I've left my code on the page. And here's what I got with the dynamic auto data control. I have a filter at the top like I had before with a dynamic data list, the details, and the add entry at the bottom. So one control. That's all I put, was one control, and we get insert, details, list, and filtering capabilities. Is this your final control? Probably not. But this is the control that'll get you started really quickly. You drop this on the page, and you can do everything with your database. You can administer your database right there. And then when you're ready to replace those controls with the controls you really want to see on your page, you're ready to go. Just delete the dynamic auto data control and replace it with the ones you want.
You also saw RSS link at the top, and Polito will talk about that in a minute. Just hold on to that.
Yes, and you'll notice we also still use the name and date. So any of those get columns customizations that you made, we will still respect in the auto data control. OK, I'm going to use this new page to create, or new control to create a couple more pages. No photojournal site would be complete without pictures. So I'm going to link to my photos table. And this time I'm going to leave the dynamic auto data control on the page. Let's run it. And our photos table has a foreign key field that points back to the entry in our entry ID in our entries table. So because of that relationship, once again, we see we get the view photos link. And I can follow this link to view the photos that are all relevant for that particular entry. And we see our auto data control, which of course we have click anywhere to select. And what we're seeing are the photos for that particular entry. Now these photos aren't on my website. These are actual photos within my database. They're image type fields, and they're contained, all the data is in the database. So if you've ever tried to build a website where the photos are in the database, you know it's very complicated. Normally what you have to do is you have to build a handler, and that handler will actually handle the request and serve up the image. Dynamic data controls do that for you automatically, no code. And you can also upload a new photo and put it in your database, all without any kind of work from you. And it works, really easily. And I'm going to add one more page. This time I'm going to add a videos page. And I'm going to make it C#, just for fun, and to show you that we work against any language. Pick your dynamic language, pick your static language, doesn't matter. And again, I get a dynamic auto data control. Now in my videos table, right here, what I have is a field called video path. And that's just a string, and that points to a video. Now that video may be on my website, it may be somewhere else, but it's probably not in your database. Videos are something that you would want to store somewhere else. And then you would supply a way to get to that, a link. So we can tell the dynamic data controls to respect that as a link to a media file. And using the new Silverlight media control that you saw this morning, we can automatically wire that up. So let's do that now. Again, I'm going to create a getColumns method. This time in C#, because that's my favorite language. And we're going to return a new object array, just like we did in Python, but it looks more like C#. And I want to see the entry ID field. And for the second parameter, for my second field, I'm going to pass in a new dynamic data column. Now, the dynamic data column has a bunch of parameters on the constructor. The first one is video. That's the name that I want to call this column. Second one, video path, is the name of the field in my database. And then I'm telling it that the link type is a media link. One more thing, we need a script manager on the page to make video work. So I'll drop a script manager on, save the page, and let's navigate to our entries page. And now you'll notice we have a View Videos link. Now my honeymoon in Fiji, I have a video for. When I click on the View Videos link, my video just automatically starts playing in the new ASP media control. I can run it full screen, or I can run it in the browser.
Again, pretty simple and straightforward, just a few lines of code.
So that's pretty cool. It's a great, easy way to use the video control.
How many of you want to see the video? No?
This is actually my honeymoon video. Might be a little embarrassing, but we can let it play.
I've seen it. It's pretty interesting.
All right. So now that we've got the whole page up and running, I think I'd like to add a new entry for my time here in Vegas. So I'm going to navigate to the entries page. And I'm going to use the Add New Entry field. And today is the 30th, I think. That's okay. And we're in the US. I'll go ahead and insert it. And now we see at the end of our list control is my new entry. You can see I mistyped. Now you know it's real. And I'll follow.
You can go ahead and edit it right
Yeah, we can edit it. Let's do that. All right. And I'd like to add a photo as well. This morning as I was walking around the Venetian, I saw the Blue Man Group. And I got to take a picture with the Blue Man Group. My entry is Vegas.
Cool.
And just like that, my photo's uploaded, and it's in my database now. Now I have a great record of being in Vegas, seeing the Blue Man Group. Okay, they were wax, but it was still really cool.
How many of you have seen Elvis here walking in the hallways? This morning I saw Elvis. Yeah, it's real.
One more cool feature of the auto data control that you might have noticed that I'd like to show off is this RSS link that's in the upper left-hand corner of my page. Now this RSS link is a link off to an RSS feed, and I can get to it two ways, either by clicking on this RSS link or by subscribing to it in my browser. Now if I set a filter within my page, this RSS link is going to respect that. And when I click on it, I'll get the feeds for just my US entries. I can also navigate this backwards. These are all links. And I can see the entry that I was at. And again, I can go to the Photos page. And this is kind of a nice experience, a nice way to let your friends and family subscribe to, say, if you have a travel journal. And it was no work. All I did was drop an auto data control on, and I got it for free.
That's cool.
So, all right, those are all the features of my travel journal site that I wanted to build and show you guys. So you may be thinking, that's great. She's got 4 tables in a travel journal site, and it worked. But my database is much larger. My database is already existing, and I don't get to change things so that it works perfectly. I want to start with the database that I have today. And I want to tell you that you can do this with the dynamic data controls. And to show you how to do it, I'm going to create a brand new website based on Northwind. I'm going to use the dynamic data website template. And I'll call it Northwind. And I've gotten a brand new website. So I have all of my data in my assemblies in bin, an app script folder, which I'm not going to be using, so I'm going to delete it, a web config, which we'll take a look at in a minute, and an app data folder. I'm going to add the Northwind database to this app data folder. And I have it on my desktop. And now let's look at web config. There's lots of stuff in here, but I'm concerned about this add path auto.axd handler. It's commented out right now, but I'd like to use it, so I'm going to uncomment it. And this auto.axd handler is something that comes with the dynamic data controls. And what it is a handler for a request to auto.axd that'll give us a menu page for all of the pages that relate to tables in our website. One more thing I'm going to change. In this dynamic data controls section, I'm going to change show all tables from false to true. And show all tables tells the dynamic data controls that I'd like to display all of my tables in this website. Now, this might not be the right choice for you. If you're putting this up right on the web and letting everybody get to it, this is not what you want to do. However, if you're starting a page from scratch and you want to get to your database, this is a great way to get started. But I do say, use this with caution and know that you're doing this as kind of an interim step. But let's take a look at what it does. I'm now going to run this. And let's look again. No pages in my website. And I'm going to navigate to auto.axt. I've gotten an auto-generated page. It shows all of the tables and all of the views. When I follow one of these links, for instance to the products table, I get the auto data control on every page. So I have filters for all of my foreign key fields and Boolean fields. And these are cascading filters. So I can set them and cascade the different categories. And I can set them to all. I can edit. And of course, sort and update, page, delete, all the things you would expect. This is a great way to get started with a database that you would like to expose on the web and start to build up your website. Now, as you replace pages for tables, one at a time, you can build the pages out, and it'll replace the ones that have been auto-generated with the ones that you've built. This is a great way to kind of build up your site slowly so that you can start with something and replace it with the things that you would like to see in your web page. And then I encourage you, once you have all those things that you would like to see exposed, to go and change that show all data back to false.
How many of you want to have the XXX chai right there? Right after this talk.
So I know some of you are saying, my table is not called photos or products. It's called __ star XYZ, and it's got some horrible name that I don't want to call my web page after. Can I change that? And yes, there is a way. Right here in the name map section of the dynamic data controls, you can change the default mapping, and you can change the way that it's mapped from page names to table names. So this lets you completely expose whatever tables you want. Naming it after the page, naming the page after the table is merely the default to get you started. If you don't like it, go ahead and change it. I encourage you to do that.
Cool.
Well, thanks. That's the end of my demo.
Cool. So actually, I want to give a big thanks both to Polita and to David Ebo back in Redmond, who've been an integral part of making this happen along with the rest of the team. And this is really, really cool stuff. This is about the bread and butter of how you do application development. It is really about making your lives easier on a day-to-day basis with database apps. Let me go back and see if I can recap some of the things that we talked about and then also point to some more things as well. So the first thing that Polita pointed at is the fact that you can start with the database, for example, just by the virtue of you having it in your app data folder will infer the fact that you want to use it, right? There's other mechanisms. You can have connection string, and if you have multiple connection string, you can specify in config, on and on. But from a simplicity, from a simple heuristics perspective, this is step number one. That's how you get started. Step number two, start with all tables. Why not? If your database is simple enough to get started, go ahead and say, hey, show all tables to be true. That's a great place to start a scaffold, and that's it. Surprising as that may sound. 2 steps, and you got a database app up and running in web app. Even I can do that. And after that, if you want to go ahead and say, yeah, I want to add some more spice to it. I want to add some optional details. I really don't want to expose my whole database. Well, I don't blame you. So you might want to just say, I just want to do, for example, in pubs, I just want to show authors as a web page. Then you can go ahead and do that. Or on and on and on. Or you can use a sort of dynamic star set of controls and say, look, I just want auto data on here. I just want a list or something else. So once you have an app up and running, we talked about you don't just get stuck there, right? You take that app and you can customize it, and you get more feature requests. You can go ahead and customize that even further. For example, all of the ASP.NET controls provide the ability to sort of customize it. And here we've shown you some example of setting background color and all that. I'll try to use the same example in a minute. But the key point here is that all of the dynamic controls are built on the infrastructure of ASP.NET, right? What does that allow you to do? it allows you, through the extender pattern, to specify, go ahead and specify an ASP.NET base control that you just point to and you say, look, in my dynamic filter control, what I really want to do is I want to use a drop-down list. You can even change that. If you want to use radio buttons, you can do that too. And here I just want to specify the control and say, look, use that instead. And that has the properties that I've set already. And that's great because you can take that and extend it. Even further, if you want to write a little bit of code, so far you haven't written any code, you want to extend that, I'll take one particular example, walk through, and I'll go through the rest of them in a bit. For example, with dynamic list, right, there are three methods that are really applicable to you. These are heuristics that we provided out of the box in the CTP, such as get columns, that says, hey, go ahead and sort of project my column list, whichever way I see fit. And I think that makes perfect sense, and I want to have customized columns. You can write expressions to do so. In addition to that, you want to control the way the rows look, you can go ahead and write what we call an init row method. In this particular case, what I'm saying here is that if there's Python in the title for any of the titles, just go ahead and make it bold, right? And I think you can go ahead and do that. Not only that, if you want to just get hold of the data source and munge it, for example, you want to write some filter expressions and really sort of basically effectively munge the data set, you can go ahead and do that as well. We're not going to get into that now, but you can go ahead and you have that power to do so. So here are the set of controls that we are providing as part of the ASP.NET CTP. We talked about dynamic list, and we talked about some of the methods and properties that you have. By the way, the control ID is something that exists on everything, so you can actually go ahead and set that to be some of the base control with certain properties if you so desire. In addition to that, for example, the dynamic details has two properties, enable update and enable delete, that are set to true by default, but you can turn that off and say, I really don't want deletion at all in my database. And that's a common scenario. You don't want people to sort of go ahead and delete records. You can set that to be false, and then that's it. They don't get to delete, though it's provided out of the box for free. In addition to that, the get details column method allows you to go ahead and select the columns in the details view that you desire to expose, right, that you desire to show to the user. And on and on. The dynamic filter, for example, can filter by column name. It can also filter by multiple columns as well. And you can set the column name as Polita has done earlier. In addition to that, if you want to say, I want the radio buttons, you can go ahead and set the filter style to be that particular style. And the navigator is the control that you saw Polita go against the large databases and shows you all the tables and shows you all the views by default, right? And you may not want your tables exposed. In fact, you may design your views precisely so that just those views are exposed. In many databases, I wouldn't want to expose my tables either. So you go ahead and set that to include tables to be false and include views to be true, and voila, you get what you want on there. And dynamic RSS is that ability to go ahead and do RSS feeds. And Autodata uses heuristics as the full enchilada that allows you to get as much of the web app as richly as possible to you, as you've seen earlier. So that's basically the full set of controls that we're providing in this CTP. And what we need is we need your feedback. And the reason we're actually here talking to you is because we need your feedback, both here and also on the forums, in the futures forums. Let us know what you think. As you use them, as you do real apps, as you use them back at your work, let us know what you think of that. By now you're thinking, okay, there must be a catch because it's darn easy to build database apps. Even this guy on stage can build it. Great. So what do you pay for it? What do you get for performance? The key point here is that you actually have very little overhead because fundamentally it's the ASP.NET infrastructure and SQL data source that we build on. By the way, the SQL data source is for this MIX CTP, and down the road we intend to extend that to include Link as well. And there's very little overhead, and some of our initial perf tests have shown that it's actually on par with the rest of the .NET framework and .NET stack for the CTP. With that said, I want to emphasize we've done zero work so far in this CTP for any performance work, but we're open for input. If you find something, let us know. So far, what I've talked to you about is the strong dynamic data story that we have, the pragmatic data controls that allow you to get a database app up and running, And in addition to that, we have this larger initiative in our team. This is born, the dynamic data controls are born out of this team that is thinking about dynamic languages and how do you program in dynamic languages and things like that. And as part of that, I want to actually cover some elements about the dynamic language aspect and what we're trying to do there, and then start to wrap up from there. So you saw earlier in Scott Guthrie's keynote the fact that we're building this thing called DLR, Dynamic Language Runtime. And dynamic language runtime is this set of libraries and infrastructure that allows this interoperability among the ecosystem of dynamic languages. So if I step back, I mean, I joined the CLR team initially in '98 when this notion of multi-language runtime was not very popular at all. People were like, why do you need that thing, right? And there's Java, hey, I got one language, I'm pretty happy about it. And it's really about democratization of languages. It really is about that. And how do you do that? Well, you need infrastructure in a deep way that provides a common type system, that provides for common hosting, that provides a deep set of infrastructure to dispatch methods so that you don't have to keep solving those hard problems. What did CLR do with languages? It sort of enabled languages to become emitters of IL, for lack of a better term. You emit IL, we'll take care of it from there. x86, x64, whatever your backend may be, IA64, and on and on and on. So basically, it democratized a set of languages. In a similar way, DLR is that infrastructure that allows you to go ahead and get a set of languages on top of the .NET framework. And today, in the CTP, we're providing 2 languages, in particular Iron Python and JScript on top of DLR that you get. And in addition to that, we have plans for both Visual Basic and Iron Ruby as well that will be upcoming in the future CTPs, and I'm actually quite excited by that. By the way, there's one talk tomorrow that I strongly recommend that you attend, which is Jim Huguenin and John Lamb are doing a talk on how do you use dynamic languages in Silverlight. This particular talk, we show you some elements about how do you use dynamic languages in ASP.NET, which is the host. But really, I mean, there's multiple different hosts the stack will show up in the long term, right? This notion of dynamic language programming, this notion of RAD programming exists not just for ASP.NET, but also for Silverlight and also for other hosts down the road. And with all of this, the best part here is that you get several things for free. The Mac debugging demo that you saw, right? I mean, that ability to get that tool support where you can go ahead and debug your Silverlight app on the Mac, right? That's pretty powerful in a dynamic language. The ability to do view source on the Silverlight app, that's pretty powerful as well. So you get all of that for free. In addition to that, we're working with third-party languages. And in particular, I'm actually responsible for making sure that ecosystem thrives on DLR and CLR. So if you have input into it, if you want to see, I don't know, somebody earlier talked to me about PHP and others, I'm open to it. Please talk to me. I'm here pretty much the rest of the couple of days. I may be a little hungover, but hey, I'll be here. That's for sure. So I want to create this large ecosystem of dynamic languages. In addition to that, they get Visual Studio support for free and the hostability in other hosts, in addition to ASP.NET and Silverlight for free as well, by being a part of a language on DLR. So I'm very excited by this effort, and I think we're doing some really, really cool work in the company. And I think this effort to me excites me as much as the initial .NET framework and CLR. And I think we're going to change the way people program in 5 years from now. And you saw some of those examples on how easy it is to get apps up and running. And with that, I actually want to transition to sort of why are we doing this with ASP.NET and what are we doing? We want to bring a set of dynamic languages, Iron Python, JScript, VBX, to ASP.NET. Yeah, some of you will obviously notice that Ruby is not on the list. I'm open to input there as well. Because one could argue that Rails is a better framework anyway for Ruby, and I don't currently have that in the plans, but I'm open to input and say, look, I want to see Ruby with ASP.NET. Actually, how many of you want to see Ruby with ASP.NET? Yeah? Okay, so I think I have my answer right there, right? So I think that's what I suspected, and that's why I didn't list, because I think Ruby doesn't really lacks client-side programming, unlike Python. Basically, Python has a bunch of frameworks, and they're pretty distributed all over on that. So I think, given that, so we're supporting a set of new languages, so you have a choice there. In addition to that, we actually allow you to go ahead and take advantage of the full stack and get a great performance out of it as well. Some of our perf numbers on dynamic languages beat open source implementations by a pretty wide margin. So with that, I want to start wrapping up and start taking some of your questions, and which is really most of this talk about the dynamic data story in ASP.NET with a little bit of Python and other demos in there as well. But you can do this with VBX and manage JScript on DLR and others as well on third-party languages. In addition to that, we have this large dynamic languages initiative that we talked about. And my call to action to you is really download the ASP.NET Futures CTP, try out the dynamic data controls, let us know what you think. And are we making your common path? Hey, this is not about snazziness and Silverlight kind of sexy apps. Database apps are not sexy by definition. I worked in Yukon, I shipped Yukon. They're not sexy by nature, but nevertheless, have we made it easier for you? That's our value prop, and I believe, and I strongly believe that we have. And if you haven't, please let us know. Thank you.
So dynamic data controls now are CTP stage. Do you
Yes.
expect those to be released with .NET 3.5 or?
So I think it will be released as part of the way we're approaching releases with ASP.NET. If you look at Atlas as a whole, right, which is put our futures out there to sort of get user feedback and to see what people like, what people don't like. And if people really like a set of controls, yes, we will RTM that as part of a future ASP.NET release.
But it could be released independently like Atlas was?
Right now, it's actually it will be part of ASP.NET Futures.
We're
as a
still
CTP
figuring out
form.
the release plans. So what we would really like is your feedback on whether these are important enough to ship separately and whether these are what you want to see shipped.
Yep.
So we're definitely figuring out what and when still, and we need your feedback for that.
Yep. And technology-wise, I mean, you can make it work on completely on.
Is Atlas on the roadmap?
I'm sorry, can you expand on the question? What do you mean by is Atlas on the roadmap?
To enable Ajax, the dynamic controls for Ajax.
So today, you can put your dynamic data control inside of an update panel, and it'll work the way that you expect it to. I didn't show that, but it'll work just like you think it should. So today, that's how you would use Atlas with the dynamic data controls.
Go ahead.
This question's probably heresy to this audience, but I got to ask. Every now and again, we have to do something more than just a slap-up website. There's like actually these things called business rules, that kind of like the middle tier. Once I try to do that, do I lose all this back to the old style, or is there any support for targeting these as an object as opposed to straight?
Yeah, so let me take that one. We have, as you know, in ASP.NET, a wide set of data source controls. We've got the SQL data source, and we've got the object data source. And you may or may not have heard that the new one that we're doing with 3.5 is the link data source. We just finished writing that. I'm really proud of our team for building that. And the link data source allows you to build all of your business logic layer into the the data context that you build. You can also choose to use object data source. That's kind of your decision. The sweet spot that I see for the dynamic data controls right now is for people who don't have a lot of business logic. But in the future, we do want to accommodate people who have business logic. And the way that we'll do that is probably by using the link data source, so that you'll have your data context in your website. You'll build your partial methods, your partial classes, and put your methods in there. And all of that will run automatically under the link world of programming. Today, if that's what you want to do, then maybe the dynamic data controls aren't for you. But what we do want to hear is your feedback, that that's what you want to see, and that's the roadmap that we want to go.
Yes, go ahead.
If the application has to call back service or store procedure instead of accessing table directly, is this going to work?
The question is if your application is calling web services or a stored procedure or something to do selection and CRUD methods, is this going to work? So this is very related to the link question that the gentleman behind you just asked. And under link, yes, you can specify the methods that you want to call on your database to update everything. And that's what you would put in your business logic layer with the the data context for link. So that is kind of a future direction for us. And we definitely know you guys are out there. And that's where we want to go in the future.
Yep. By the way, my understanding is that Anders is talking about linked data source in this talk in about half an hour.
Yeah,
The next talk, whatever the
4:30
time
and
is.
I think 4005.
Yes.
With these controls, if multiple users are using your web page, right? How do you handle concurrency, roll-up concurrency, conflicts, things like that?
So the SQL data source that we're using today, the dynamic data controls build their own commands. And the commands they build today do not use optimistic concurrency. But again, when we go towards link, what you'll do is you set the column attribute on your link methods. And the column attribute has a property on it that's the update check method, the update check property. And that's how you set optimistic concurrency within link. And what you'll do in the future is you'll open up your data context, set the update check property for all of your properties, and that will determine how those update, insert, delete methods are constructed. So that's the optimistic concurrency story going forward.
Yes.
Is there like any thought of like when this builds is to have it like build a scaffold type class? You could actually go in and intercept certain method calls and stuff like that, rather than just having those built-in methods.
So you're asking if there is more extensibility than the get columns and the get details columns. There's all the extensibility that's available for grid view and details view, which is pretty in-depth. There are lots and lots of events on those. And you can handle any of those events and write code for those, and they will run against your dynamic list control, your dynamic details control.
You can still hook all the events.
Yes, all those events you still get. We don't want to take any of the customizability away from you that you have in ASP.NET today.
In the back? Yes.
When extending the control, like the details view, when you're extending it with these dynamic controls, how far can you go into extending them? Like, for example, one of the fields is a text box or date in the detail view. If I wanted to use the AJ control center for a calendar, can you go that deep into the detail view, or are you just extending the detail view itself, not any control within it?
Okay, so the question is about whether you can extend the subproperties and the collections within the details view, for instance. And you can. You can declare your fields collection in the details view, and you can put your field in the details view fields collection and bind that the way you would. Most of our extensibility points are through the get columns, but we understand that you're going to want to do stuff that's more complicated. And if you find areas that you think need even more customizability, then please post to the forum that's on ASP.NET and tell us, and we can use that as feedback. But we do think that there are lots of places that you can customize. You can add your own fields.
Somebody had a question there. Okay, so we're around, and we got the band, so feel free to chat with us. And thank you so much.
Thanks
and
a lot.
fill out the eval, please. Thank you.